Hey guys, Tyler Berger here at BassFishingHQ, and today is all about the big rod, the big line, and the big weight. I'm talking punching for bass. Stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. So if you guys are new to the channel, or maybe you're new to bass fishing, what is punching specifically? And I'm not talking about boxing, I'm not talking about that kind of punching. I'm talking about punching mats for bass. And this is a great technique to catch giant bass. And it works all across the country. Anywhere where you get this matted vegetation, you're gonna be able to punch mats and be able to catch big bass. And it's a year-round thing. So basically what punching is you're taking a really big weight, and basically it's just a big Texas rig that you're going to have with about an ounce to almost 2 ounce weight at time, and you're punching it through matted vegetation to get to where bass are hiding in holes and canopies underneath of this matted vegetation. And that's basically the technique. Today is all about breaking down that technique, exactly what you need to do. I'm talking about when, where, how, why, your equipment, everything like that that you need. So matted vegetation can really be a lot of different things, right? Like milfoil can mat up, hydrilla can mat up. You have different types of vegetation that actually float on the water, like hyacinth and water lettuce. There's a lot of different types of mats that you can come across all over the country. From Florida to Texas, all the way up to Maine and Minnesota, you're gonna have mats. You have things that we call as fishermen cheese mats, right? This is your typical slop mat that people like to throw frogs on. And the thing is you have them in lakes and reservoirs, and you have mats in a lot of ponds. This is something that you see a lot in ponds, and it's something that a lot of pond fishermen may not even take advantage of. And sometimes you even have mats that are made out of wood. You know, you can have log jams on river systems that are basically nothing but a wooden big mat that sometimes you get sawdust that collects, all kinds of different stuff to mat. But the concept is still the same, right? You're typically taking a bigger weight, usually over an ounce, and you're punching through that mat to get to where the bass are. And this is a great way to catch big bass. Let's break this down. One of the first tips that I can give you when it comes to mat, and this is extremely important, is you have to pay attention to how bass are positioned underneath a mat. A lot of times you're gonna see that bass are actually on the bottom underneath mats, right? This happens a lot when you're fishing shallow mats. If you're fishing 1 or 2 foot mats, you're typically gonna have those fish that are actually just laying on the bottom underneath the mats. Now, those really shallow mats occur a lot up in the northern country. In your Michigans and Minnesotas and New Yorks, you have a lot of those shallow mats that can produce really, really well. And sometimes it's just chopped up grass that has floated to the shore and has created a mat. And that's a really good location to catch some big largemouth under these mats. But getting back to the bass position, sometimes you have mats that are actually in 6 to even 10 or 12 foot of water, okay? So you have a lot of water under those, and sometimes the bass will position differently underneath mats. Sometimes, like I said, they'll be on the bottom, but sometimes those bass will actually be fairly high in the water column, and they'll be just underneath those mats. Now, in a mat, you have a whole ecosystem that lives in that mat, right? And they live under that mat. You have different types of like little shrimp and crawdads. And a lot of those bait fish and creatures will use the underside of a mat as kind of where they live. So one thing that I really want to stress is sometimes you'll be fishing and you'll find that the bass hits your lure. Once you punch through that mat, it hits it right away. And if that happens, what you got to realize is that the bass is probably positioned right underneath of the mat. Really, really important to be observant and to take note of when this is happening, because one technique that I like to do, you know, typically when you're mat fishing, you flip into a mat that punches through, you yo-yo it a couple of times, you bring it out and you keep going, right? That's how you kind of fish mats. But when the bass is sitting right underneath that mat, a lot of times what I actually like to do is I'll actually punch through the mat, raise that Texas rig heavy weight to this. Basically, if this is the mat, I'll raise the bait to the top of the mat and I'll kind of just bounce it on the very top of the mat like this. And those bass will actually come up and they'll eat that bait from underneath the mat and take it down. So that's why it's really important to pay attention to the bass's position under a mat. Are they right underneath the mat? Are they on the bottom? And there's really no rhyme or reason to this. I don't think that it's, on cloudier days they're positioned here, or on sunnier days they position here. I just think you have to pay attention. You really don't know this until you start fishing. So pay attention to the bass's position. Another thing that I think is extremely important, and this is kind of tip number 2 to this video, is that I think that it's really important to use the lightest weight possible when punching mats. Now, sometimes you literally have to use a big weight, an ounce and a half, an ounce and 3/4 weight to actually be able to penetrate a mat. But whenever you can get away with a lighter weight, I definitely suggest doing that. What tends to happen a lot of times when you're fishing a big weight is when you set the hook on a fish, you tend to blow the lips of a bass wide open because that weight hits them from the inside. Now, I'm not saying they're gonna open their mouth completely, but it'll get it just enough where that hook can actually slip through if it's at the right angle. So the smaller weight that you have, the less of a chance it is that that weight is going to come out and actually blow those lips open where that hook comes through. So that is why I think it is so important that you use the smallest weight possible while still being efficient. Now, this is a big key to this. If you're flipping 10 times into a mat, you don't want only one of them to go through, right? Then you're using too small of a weight. You want to be able to be efficient. If you can dob your cricket in more mats than other competitors or other fishermen, you're going to have a lot better likelihood of catching a lot more fish and a lot bigger fish by doing that. So make sure you're using as light as a weight possible while still being efficient. If you can do that, your hookup ratio is going to be a lot better, and that's exactly what you want. If you could, the biggest thing that people have issues with when it comes to mat fishing is typically just getting a hook in the fish and then getting that fish out. And we're about to talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about actually hooking up with a fish under a mat, because this is probably the biggest thing that people have issues with when they're punching matted vegetation is they'll get bit from a fish, they'll set the hook, and they just straight miss the fish. And I talked a little bit about that just a minute ago. One of the things that you want to make sure to have a better hookup rate is use a smaller weight if possible. You're definitely going to want to use a tungsten weight in this case, but also using the lightest weight, the smallest profile weight that you can get away with is going to allow you to hook up with more fish. Now, the other extremely important thing, and I learned this the hard way, right, is you want to tie a snell knot. I can't stress to you guys how important it is to tie a snell knot in this scenario. You want to make sure you tie a snell knot. I'm going to keep saying that. You want to tie a snell knot when you're fishing. And I didn't always think that this was true. I thought I could get away. And sometimes, you might get away with it for a little bit. But I noticed almost an instant change from hooking up with a lot less fish using, your typical Palomar knots or double pinsons or different knots. If you go to a snell knot, I'm telling you, you're going to start hooking up a lot more with fish under mats. The way that hook cavitates when it comes up, it really allows you to get that hook somewhere in the fish's mouth where they're going to get hooked and you're going to get a good hook in them. Here's the other extremely important thing about when you're mat fishing and trying to hook up with fish. We talked about the snell knot. We talked about using as small a weight as possible. The other thing is the hook set. Your hook set is so important when we're talking about punching. You do not want to give these frickin' fish the bananas, right? You do not want to put the mustard to the hot dog in this case, right? And I know that sounds a little bit weird. You have a big fish in heavy vegetation. You think, I got to give this thing everything I got to get him out. And that is not what you want to do. You are very close to that fish a lot of times when you are flipping mats, right? It's not like you're a long ways away. You got a big rod. You usually have braided line, 65-pound line. You're really close to that fish. You do not want to give this fish all you got, because if you do that, there's going to be two things that happen, right? If you give a fish, if you slack line, hook set, hard hook set a bass under a mat, what typically happens is you blow that fish's mouth open with that big weight and it won't even get hooked. You get bit and you feel like it's a big one, you give it everything and you just completely miss the fish, right? This happens a lot. If you've mat fished before, You probably have done this before where you get excited, that fish thumps that bait as soon as it goes through the mat and you get it the freaking potatoes, and you just swing and miss. And that's what happens is you blew that fish's mouth open with the big weight and you didn't even get a hook in it. Here's the other thing that happens. If you happen to hook a fish when you do that, because you are so close to that fish, you typically will tear a pretty good size hole in that fish's mouth. And that is not a good thing at all, right? Especially when you're talking about like those 2 to 4 pound fish that have a little bit smaller mouth. You might rip a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch tear in that fish's mouth because of you setting the hook so hard. So when you do that, you have this big hole in a fish's mouth, and now you have a big weight with a hook connected to it in a big hole. There's a lot of slack for that hook to move all around. The weight can just bounce around and you're gonna lose that fish. So that's really what happens when you set the hook super hard, especially if you slack line a hook set. When you drop the slack in the line and set them, you don't want to do that in this case. So here's the other thing. When you get bit under a mat, it is what I call a swift pull. You want to make sure when you start the hook set that you're feeling the pressure from the fish actually pull you down. So make sure you reel up your slack in your bait, and then it's a very swift pull, right? It's not a snap hook set. It's just a swift pull. You know, like the fish, boom, he hits it, reel down tight, swift pull. That's all it is. A pull hook set like that is not going to blow that fish's mouth open quite as bad, and it's also just going to very easily penetrate that fish's mouth. You're going to get a good hook in and through the bone of that fish, and it's not going to tear a big hole. That's the perfect scenario. If you hook a fish properly when mat fishing, it's not going to get off, okay? It's hooked with a single big hook. It's not going to get off. So the last little tip that I want to talk to you guys about when punching mats is really about your equipment. Your equipment is a must when it comes to mat fishing. And again, like we talked about earlier, here's the couple of things you want. You're going to want a 3 or 4/0 hook. Now, I know that might sound on the smaller side of things, and I don't know why this is, but I have had a lot better success flipping a 3 or 4/0 as opposed to flipping a 5 or 6/0 under a mat. That doesn't really make sense like logically, but I've just seen it. And so that's what I'm going to suggest to you. A lot of times when you're flipping mats, you're flipping smaller baits, right? You might be fishing a BB cricket or a very small beaver style bait, or what I like to flip a lot is a Zoom speed crawl. It's a very small, compact bait. You don't need a giant hook in that thing. And so flipping with a 3 or 4/0, actually I tend to have a little bit better hookup ratio. You're gonna want 50 to 65 pound line. If you can get away with 50 pound line, then I'm gonna say flip with 50. 50 is gonna be easier to handle. It's plenty strong enough. It's going to be a little bit more silent when it comes to yo-yoing that bait in a mat. And so 50 pound test is what I flip with a lot. Sometimes I do go up to 65 if I'm in an area where there's just big ins, like catching a double-digit bass is common or it happens, I might step it up to 65 pound test in that case. But for the most part, I use a lot of 50 pound tests. So here's probably the most critical part about mat fishing, and that is your rod. You do not want a super stiff rod when it comes to flipping mats. If you look at almost any of the big flippers out there, I'm talking the Greg Hackneys of the world, Randall Tharps of the world. If you look at Mikey Balls, he's got a big YouTube channel and he does a lot of mat fishing. He's extremely good. And he says this same thing. You do not want an extra heavy, a huge rod in this case. I like a heavy action, don't get me wrong, but I do not want a broomstick. You need to have some give in that rod, right? Because again, like we talked about earlier, you are typically close to that fish, and you do not want a broomstick because, if you set the hook with a broomstick, even if you do a fast pull set, you're typically going to rip a hole in that fish's mouth, and that is a no-no. That's how you're going to lose a lot of fish, and we don't want to lose a lot of fish. So you want a rod that is a heavy action because you want it to be powerful, but you do not want it to be a broomstick. You want it to have more of that parabolic bend, if anything. This particular rod that I have here is a flippin' Punchin big swim bait rod. It's a 711 by Okuma. It is the rod that I would recommend because of the bend of this rod. So equipment is super important. Your rod is probably the most important. And then when it comes to your reel, I typically like an 8 to 1 to 1. I think anything over an 8 1 to 1, it might be a little bit too much in heavy vegetation, meaning that if you set the hook, although you're using mostly your rod to get that fish out, you still are cranking down, and the higher gear ratio you go, the harder it is going to be to turn that handle. Now, you do not want to go too low at all. Like I said, you're not cranking these fish out, you're mostly using the rod. So an 8 1 to 1 is perfect to me. I use 7 3 to 1s as well. Anything in that range I think is going to be perfect when it comes to mat fishing. So one last tip when it comes to punching mats is instead of trying to drag fish out, I would stress to go in, right? This kind of comes back to the same thing. If you hook into a really big bass under a mat, it a lot of times is going to open its mouth wide open, and you're not going to be able to get that fish through the top of that mat just because its mouth is wide open. And the more you pull and the more you wrench on it, the more you're going to make a big hole in that fish's face. And again, this is not only good for the fish's health, but it's going to allow you to not lose these fish. So instead of trying to pull that fish out with all your might, you need to go in and get that fish. Whatever you need to do, ram that mat with your trolling motor, especially if it's a big fish. Ram the mat with your trolling motor. You got to get to that fish to be able to get it out. So guys, in my opinion, those are the most important things that you need to know when it comes to mat fishing. I hope you enjoyed this style of video. If you did, again, leave a like below, share this with a friend, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.